What's going on, everybody? Kalipis Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you some of my favorite and least favorite things about this phone to help you decide whether or not it's the right one for you. Now, before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about this phone, be sure to check out my full review and tips and tricks videos for it on the channel. But with that being said, let's get started. So my first pro for the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G is the storage. With this phone, we're getting 128GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, and in addition to this, there's also a variant that comes with 256GB. So no matter which variant you get, you are going to be getting a lot of storage. For the average user, 128GB is going to be perfectly fine. In fact, it's probably more than you'll ever need. And if you're really a power user, if you have a bunch of apps and stuff like that, you can always get the variant with 256GB, or if you just have a bunch of photos and videos and stuff like that, you could always offload that to a microSD card as well. So either way, if you're looking for a phone that has a lot of storage, then the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G is a great option. To give you an idea of what the storage actually looks like on this phone, as you can see, I am using about 42, almost 43GB of space on this phone, and it's only taking up 33% of the total storage. So despite everything I have on this phone, I have over 80GB left. Now, as far as what I'm actually using on here, I have a couple photos and videos, and I also have the regular apps you might use on a daily basis, so stuff like social media, streaming platforms, that sort of thing, and I also have a decent amount of games as well. And as you can see here, the system is actually taking up a ton of space itself at 23.27GB, so this really just goes to show that in this day and age, things are really taking up more and more space. And as far as storage goes, with the lower end phones that have only 32GB, or even some that have 64, for the average user, it's really starting to not cut it anymore. So in this day and age, even if you're not a heavy user, I still do recommend getting a phone that has more storage than you think you need, because of course it's better to have more storage that you never use than it is to run out. My second pro for the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G is the camera setup. Now with this phone, we got a real nice looking hole punch design for the front facing camera, and this camera is 32 megapixels. So not only does the camera itself look real nice and modern, but it also is pretty powerful. So if you're taking lots of selfies, for example, or maybe vlogging or something like that, then this is going to be a great thing. Then on the back, we got a quad camera setup with a 108 megapixel main camera, a 12 megapixel ultra wide camera, a 5 megapixel macro camera, and a 5 megapixel depth sensing camera for portrait mode. So as far as features go, this phone has pretty much everything. So if you're taking a lot of photos and you want a wider variety of features, then this is definitely going to be a great thing. And in addition to just having a lot of features, the actual photo quality is great as well. Sure, it's not going to be near the level of a $1,400 flagship phone like the Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra, but if you are taking a good amount of photos you want to keep for something, then it will absolutely get the job done. To give you an idea of what this camera can do, here's some photos taken with the main camera. As you can see, these are real high quality photos. Now I did use the full 108 megapixels of the camera, which you do actually have to specifically activate in the settings, but if you want to learn more about how to do that, definitely check out my camera tips and tricks video for this phone. But essentially, as you can see, with the full power of the camera, you can definitely get some real nice photos with this phone. Now again, are they going to be quite as good as something like a Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra or an iPhone 13 Pro Max? Not really. Sure, they are good, and in certain situations like social media, for example, where the platforms really compress the images anyway, you might not really be able to tell the difference. But in a more professional setting, maybe you're taking pictures for a website, for example, then sure, in that situation, this phone is not going to be quite as good as a flagship phone. But again, for most users, I would say the photo quality you get with this camera will get the job done. Now this phone can record videos in 4K as well in both the rear and front cameras. Unfortunately, it's only limited to 30 frames per second. So if you want to get real smooth clips with a higher frame rate, or maybe you're making a slow motion video or something like that, unfortunately you will have to use 1080p with this phone. But if you're just recording normal videos and you want to use a higher resolution, then it's definitely going to be a nice thing. So overall, no matter what way you look at it, for a mid-range phone, the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G is definitely a great choice when it comes to the camera. My third pro for the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G is the display. With this phone, we're getting a 6.7 inch 120Hz Super AMOLED Plus display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 392, and an aspect ratio of 20:9. So first of all, we're getting a really large display here. Sure, there are some phones out there that are still larger, but at 6.7 inches, you're definitely getting the advantages of having a really large display. So if you're consuming content, you're gonna get a real good experience on here, and things are gonna be a lot easier to see. and this is going to be great for stuff like reading as well. In addition to just being large, we're also getting some real good dimensions here. With an aspect ratio of 20:9, we got a taller and more narrow form factor, and this is going to be great for doing stuff in landscape mode. So if you're doing something like watching a video in landscape mode, for example, you're going to get a much more cinematic, immersive experience, and things are just going to look better in general, and this also goes for mobile gaming. Aside from the size and dimensions, the display itself is also great quality. With the 1080p resolution, we're going to get a sharper, crisper image, and with the Super AMOLED Plus display, this is definitely some great display technology. It's going to make the screen a little bit brighter, and we're also going to get some good viewing angles here. So if you're outside in the sun, for example, you'll be able to see your phone a lot easier than you would with something like an LCD. And if that wasn't enough, we also got a 120Hz refresh rate, and this higher refresh rate is going to make the movement on the screen a little bit faster and smoother. So if you're doing something like watching a video, playing a game, stuff that has motion on the screen, you're going to get a much better experience. And even when you're just navigating through the phone in general, it's going to feel a little bit more premium. So in general, whether you're doing a lot of stuff like watching videos, playing games, reading, or you're just on your phone a lot and you want a phone with a really good display, this phone is going to be a great choice. My fourth pro for the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G is the processor. With this phone, we're getting 8GB of RAM with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 778G 5G processor. So for a mid-range phone, this is definitely one of the faster phones on the market, and in my experience, even though it's not quite flagship level as far as performance goes, this is a really fast device, probably even faster than you're actually expecting. So no matter what you're doing on this phone, whether you're doing stuff like mobile gaming, and I have done a pretty good amount of that on this phone, or if you're just on your phone a lot doing lots of web browsing, social media use, that sort of thing, no matter what you're doing with this phone, it will get the job done perfectly fine. Now again, it's not going to be quite at the level of something like the Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra, but at the same time, for a mid-range phone, compared to other mid-range phones like for example the Moto G Stylus 5G, or even a Samsung Galaxy A53 5G, in more of that type of category, you are going to see a significant difference between those phones and this phone. Now that being said, I did run a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on this phone, and it came back with a single core score of 773 and a multi-core score of 2888. Now by itself, this might not mean a whole lot to you because after all, you really do need something to compare it to. So what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and comparing your scores to these to see whether or not this phone will be an upgrade for you, because depending on what you have, it may or may not be. Of course, if you have something like a Samsung Galaxy A52 5G, for example, this really more of a mid-range phone, then this phone is definitely going to be an upgrade. But if you have maybe something like an S10, then it might not be. So whether or not this phone is actually going to feel fast to you kind of depends on what you have now. But that being said, again, in my experience, this phone is really fast. I've done a lot of different things on it and I've had no performance issues whatsoever. So if you're looking for a phone that not only has 5G connectivity, but also has a really powerful processor, then this phone is going to be a great choice. Now my fifth pro for the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G is that it has NFC. Now seeing that this is technically an international phone, this isn't really that surprising, because I want to say pretty much every international phone does have NFC anyway, so it's not really that big a deal. But here in the US, there are plenty of phones, even mid-range phones, that still don't have NFC, and since contactless mobile payment services are becoming more and more popular and widely used, I feel like in 2022, pretty much every phone should have this feature. So if you do like to make contactless mobile payments using tap and pay, then you'll be happy to know that with the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G, you absolutely can. But now that we've gone over some of the good things about this phone, let's talk about some of the drawbacks. So my first con for the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G is that there's no headphone jack. So as you can see here, there really is no 3.5mm headphone jack. And while wireless headphones are great, I mean, I don't even use wired headphones. I know a lot of people out there still do use normal headphones. And even if you don't, it's still always nice to have the option to. And it doesn't even just have to be headphones. What if you have an aux cord in an older car or something like that? There are plenty of uses for a 3.5mm headphone jack. And while a lot of flagship phones haven't had headphone jacks for quite a while, remember the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G is still not a flagship phone. Despite being a sort of higher end mid-range phone, it still is a mid-range phone. And I feel like it just makes sense to give all mid-range phones headphone jacks. But unfortunately, seeing the direction things are going, it's probably not going to be too long before Samsung and all the other manufacturers for that matter start to do away with headphone jacks altogether. Now that being said, you can technically still get an adapter for the USB-C port, so looking at it that way, if you do have a pair of wired headphones you want to use, you're not completely out of luck. But at the same time, in my opinion, I feel like taking away the headphone jack has far more cons than pros. Now my second con for the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G is the materials. Now with this phone, despite having decent build quality, I mean, it doesn't feel like it's gonna fall apart or anything. It is made entirely of plastic, except of course the glass display. And while this is really not very surprising, I mean, again, this is a mid-range phone. I feel like a higher end mid-range phone like this, especially one that MSRPs for almost $600, should have at least a little bit better materials. I mean, the Samsung Galaxy A53 5G, that's quite a bit less expensive than this phone, has the exact same materials and pretty much the same design as well. So with this phone, design-wise, it's really not that impressive. And in addition to just the materials, it also doesn't have a whole lot of weight to it. And now, if you're coming from another mid-range phone, this is probably not going to be a surprise. In fact, a lot of people might not even care at all. But if you're coming from a higher end phone, maybe an older flagship phone like an S10 for example, then you definitely are going to notice, because those phones tend to have a lot higher quality materials. And with this phone, again, while the build quality is pretty good, the actual materials themselves don't really feel premium at all. And that really kind of brings me to my next con for this phone, and that is the boring design. Now again, take this with a grain of salt, because in general, I do think this phone is pretty good, but it's really nothing new. I mean, it looks exactly the same as the Samsung Galaxy A72 that came out last year. And not only that, but the Samsung Galaxy A33 5G basically looks like a mini version of this phone. Now for the sake of comparison, this is the Samsung Galaxy A72 5G, the 4G predecessor to this phone that came out in 2021. And as you can see, it really looks pretty much the same. The design hasn't really changed at all, and although I don't think either phone looks bad by any means, I feel like it would have been nicer if Samsung came up with at least somewhat of a different design. To add to this point, here's the Samsung Galaxy A33 5G, which again is basically just a mini version of the A73 5G. Sure, it's a couple of tiers below it, but the point is they look pretty much the same except different sizes. So in general, again, this isn't really to say that the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G has a bad design per se, because I do think it does look pretty decent and definitely really practical for what it is, but at the same time, it's really not very interesting. So again, the bottom line is, if you're coming from something like a Samsung Galaxy S10 for example, and you're expecting something a little bit more premium and interesting looking, then the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G might not be your best option. Now my fourth con for the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G is there's no wireless charging. Now this is one of those features where if you've never used it before, you might not completely understand the point of it, but I will say if you have wireless charging, it's definitely a nice feature to have. Not only is it really convenient, but it's also good for cable management. If you have a wireless charger on your desk, you're much less likely to have a bunch of wires in the way. In addition to this, if something happens to your charging port, which I've actually seen this happen several times, usually you're either going to have to pay to fix it or just get rid of the phone entirely. But with wireless charging, you can just use a wireless charger instead of a cable. So in general, wireless charging does have various different uses, and it's not really just a convenience thing. It definitely has a lot of practicality to it, and it's also not really that crazy of a feature either. Sure, it's not going to change your life, but it's still a nice thing to have. And seeing that there are plenty of phones that are a lot less expensive than this, like the Visible Midnight for example, that phone's $100 and it still has wireless charging. I know Samsung easily could put wireless charging in their phones if they wanted to, but it's one of those features that they're intentionally saving for flagship phones. So again, on one hand, if you've never had wireless charging and you don't think you'd use that feature, then this of course would not be a big deal at all. But on the other hand, if you're coming from an older flagship phone for example, where wireless charging is more of a thing you're used to, then again, just keep in mind the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G does not have wireless charging, and if that is a feature you're used to, then you're probably going to be disappointed here. Now my fifth and final con for the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G is the availability. Now in case you don't know, the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G is not officially launched in the US. Now that doesn't mean you can't get it, because it's actually decently easy to find factory unlocked on eBay and stuff, but unfortunately what that does mean is that if you are in the US, you're not going to be able to get it with any deals through a carrier. And carriers like Cricket and Metro for example have tons of really good deals for stuff like Samsung Galaxy A53 5Gs, and seeing that the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G is significantly better than that phone, it would have been really cool if this phone was offered through US carriers, because then you could probably get a really good deal on it. But unfortunately, since again this phone is not officially launched in the US, if you really want it, you are going to have to get it through something like eBay or maybe Amazon once it eventually comes available, and because of that you're probably going to have to pay full price for it, if not really close to it. And to add on to that point, again, this phone, while being a mid-range phone and not nearly as expensive as something like a Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra or a new iPhone, it's still really not cheap. It was originally going for around $579, and I've personally seen ones that are a lot lower than that now. But that being said, again, if you're hoping to get a crazy deal on this phone, like how you can get an A53 5G for $200 at Cricket, or sometimes even for free depending on your carrier, then unfortunately that's not going to be the case with this phone. But those were my pros and cons for the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G. In general, despite a few relatively minor drawbacks, I do think the Samsung Galaxy A73 5G is a really good phone that has great performance, a really good camera, and lots of other stuff that provide quite a bit of value for the money. Now remember, if you want to learn more about this phone, its specs, and its features, be sure to check out my full review and tips and tricks videos for it on the channel. But that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you found this information useful as well. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. But as always, I will see you in the next one.